So, if all goes according to plan, this will be the last episode of the country visits that we're doing on our trips. And as much as I want to keep saying that we're visiting London, it turns out London is just a city in England, and we'll be visiting England. And I'm excited to share this episode with everyone. Joining us today to talk about England, his home, is my friend John. John, welcome to My Home is Special.
Thank you, Keith. It's great to be here.
Now, John, I always like to have people introduce themselves, and this will be no different. So can you take a moment and introduce yourself to everybody listening?
Sure. My name is John Huggett. I was born in a small town in the south of England called East Grinstead. And over the years, I really had sort of three tangled careers or life stories. One is that I went into business. I did an MBA. I worked for Bain. That's how I know Keith. And these days, I'm mostly either a board advisor or an executive coach. In parallel to that, I've always had a love of travel. When I was a little boy, my great granddad was still alive. He'd been in the Royal Navy for 25 years back in the day, and he always encouraged me to think about travel. And I'm lucky to say that I've now visited 114 countries, and I still want to visit more. It's sort of an addiction that I have, and it's legal. It doesn't cause too much harm yet. Anyway.
Oh my gosh. Once you get into that though, John, you start getting to countries that you're probably not supposed to visit, I imagine.
Yes, it's quite a few of those, and getting on airlines that you shouldn't be on as well to get there. The third sort of strand through my life, which tangles with the other two, is that I've done a lot of work for LGBT equality around the world. I did when I was in San Francisco in the 90s. I was chair of the board of the Stop AIDS Project. I'm currently on the board of an organization in London called Give Out, and one in San Francisco called the Al One Foundation. And in all, I've done around about 8 different organizations. One of which was BGLAD, the Bain Gay and Lesbian Alliance for Diversity, which I was one of the founders of. That's my strands.
That's awesome, and it's really necessary work. One of the things that you talked about was being from East Grinstead there. Can you say a little bit about East Grinstead? Because again, I'm one of those folks who always thinks England is London and a bunch of land around it.
East Grinstead is a small town of about 20,000 people, about an hour south of London, about an hour north of the south coast. It's been called one of the strangest towns in England. The Guardian reported it as such. And for some reason, even though we're a small town, a number of minority religions have set up camp there. So the world headquarters of Scientology was there for a long time. It's now the UK headquarters. The Mormon Church headquarters in Europe is just outside the town. There are pagans, Rosicrucians, Opus Dei, a lot of different minority religions have set up. And a lot of folks have scratched their heads as to quite why. And it's a little odd because it's a small town with not much to do. And it used to have a reputation for being quite boring. There was a playwright called Alan Ayckbourn who in the 60s wrote a trilogy of plays called The Norman Conquest. And in that, he would have his protagonists go for a, quote, romantic weekend, unquote, in East Grinstead, which was always innuendo for a dirty weekend because there's nothing else to do there. And we kind of wondered why we had this. I think one of the stories about it might be out of Battle of Britain, which was overhead. My grandmothers remember watching it, coming out of the house to see the fighters fight. And there was a small hospital in the town where, in fact, my grandfather worked and other relatives have worked since, where a New Zealand cosmetic surgeon happened to come to help with the war in 1940. And he was a cosmetic surgeon and was a little bit familiar with skin grafting. And what he did was he helped a lot of the pilots who'd been shot down and very, very badly disfigured and burned by taking skin grafting to a whole new level by essentially taking skin off their legs or wherever it was not burned and putting it on their faces or wherever they'd lost a huge amount of skin. It was very experimental. A lot of the guys realized that without that they would die. They called themselves the guinea pigs. And he, being a cosmetic surgeon, understood the importance of the psychology. And he implored the town, please treat them normally, please accept them as they are. And they in turn called my hometown the town that didn't stare. And it was certainly as a little kid, it was something you learned early on, you do not stare at people. And in particular, when one of my dad's friends was one of the guinea pigs, and to a little boy, his face was fascinating. It was like crazy paving. I remember once I was staring at it and got a severe rebuke from my mother, you do not stare at Uncle Derek. So that's my hometown. It's a little strange, a little weird, but I'm proud of it. And I don't mind us being called the weirdest town in England.
That's really awesome. The second question I always ask, I'm going to fast forward through because you sort of alluded to it, which is we work together. And
Yes.
from my side of it, I remember meeting you at a training, although I think we had met and maybe even worked together on some things earlier. But we sat next to each other at dinner at training and just had a chance to talk. And honestly, John, your worldview and from my view, how you thought about queer rights and queer activism was very clear and very evident. And it resonated with me in terms of some of the things I had tried to do in the Black community. I just remember thinking to
Hmm.
myself, man, I am so fortunate to work at a place where some of the most senior people at the firm are this down to earth and care this much about social issues. And
Hmm.
so that was probably, I don't know, 15, maybe even 20 years ago at this point. But I do remember that conversation and just thinking very highly of you. So when I reached out after, I don't know, not even hearing from each other for a decade and asked you to do this, you responded within 24 hours. And I am super grateful and really excited to get into it today.
Keith, thank you very much for the kind words. I remember the conversation too, and then to me it was great that there were younger folks at Bain who were thinking about social issues from a different angle, and we could entangle our thoughts and learn from each other. That was probably 25 years ago now.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
That's
quarter
amazing.
of a century. Yeah.
Well, here we are, and we're about to talk about England. Before we get into the things that are special to you, I have to admit, and I alluded to it earlier, when I think England, I almost always think London. And you almost
Hmm.
always think of London as the country. People use it interchangeably like I do with England. But England is a lot more than just London. And I was curious, as somebody who didn't grow up in London, what's a good way to orient yourself to the island? Can you tell where people are from and can you see clear distinctions in the culture as you travel around England?
Yeah, very much so. The first thing I think that people pick up on is the language or the accent, which
Right.
a lot of foreigners don't really understand. But in English society, the main signifier of geography and class is accent. And towards the extremes, it becomes a dialect. I
Hmm.
lived for 5 years in Newcastle, which is in the north of England, and the folks there are called Geordies, and they have a very, very strong dialect. I can understand it now. I lived there for 5 years, but the number of times I get into a taxi late at night to go home and they go, "Why, Bonnie lad, we're again?" And I was, "Oh, wake up, John."
And translate that for us. What was that? Was it where
Hello,
are
young
you
man, where are you going? And as a result, I mean, I must confess, I very much like living there. I've not had a desire to go back, but I still have a tendency when I call a call center and I hear a Geordie accent, I breathe a sigh of relief. This is going to be a kind, practical person who's going to help me solve my problems.
right, right. And is are there other accents or dialects that you see around the island that you can also identify? Like if you meet somebody, in your travels in the US or somewhere else in the world and they say they're from England, do you can you tell where they're from their accent?
Yes, I can. I mean, certainly different parts of the north and the west and the east. I nailed somebody yesterday, not yesterday, so the last month to within about 20 miles of his hometown. And the strangest one was I had an interview on the phone with a guy whose name sounded very American once. He was in Geneva, but actually he was English, and I managed to nail him within 5 miles.
That's amazing. We had
Yeah.
Ema on the podcast a while ago, and he was living in Chicago, but he's from Bolivia. And he talked about one of the things that was special for him about home was being able to speak his own Spanish.
Hmm.
And I never really thought about it, but one of the ways he helped me relate to it was just saying, it's like when you're in the US, everybody's speaking English, but you might hear a different accent from down south or up in the Northeast. It's the same thing when you speak Spanish. And I hadn't really
Yeah,
thought about that, but even here we talk about the English accent, the British accent. And what I'm, realizing or realized a while ago, I guess, is there's lots of different British accents as well. And it means the same thing there as it does here when you hear somebody from the South or from Boston or from other parts of the US.
that's right. And vocabulary too. There's a word, a twitten, which from where I grew up was a standard word, but outside of Sussex, my home county, no one knows what it means.
What do you mean?
If you can imagine an alleyway between two houses, which has a hedge either side, like a footpath you go down, like a cut through, which you can't drive down, but you can walk down, that's called a twitten. And in the north, they call it a ginnel. In London, they call it an alley. I think in the US, you call it a cut through. I mean, it's one minor thing, but it's one of those words which you grow up with and then realize the moment you go to 50 miles from home, people go, "What?"
John, thanks for sharing a little bit about just the island and the different dialects and accents that you hear. When we talked about the things that were special to you, I thought about what I saw when I visited London. many, many times, and I saw pubs all over the place. And I oftentimes, especially if it was in the evening, there'd be like a dozen people standing around with this giant mug of beer, pint, I believe, just laughing and carrying on into the evening. And I wasn't surprised that you mentioned it, but the way you talked about pub culture in England was really interesting to me. Can you share that with people listening? Because I thought it was really fascinating.
Sure. I mean, pubs are and always were a place where people gathered and mixed. My dad took me for a drink in the pub when I was 16. I slid in with mates occasionally when I was 15, but from 16, I started going fairly regularly. And legally, we weren't supposed to drink under the age of 18, but no one carried ID. And so all you had to do was to be able to ask rapidly the answer to the question, what was your birthday? And as long as you said a date that was plausible, they'd serve you. And for years, I remember my date was 19th of March 1955, and which would have made me overage at that point. Needless to say, some years later, people would ask me my birthday, and I'd come up with the wrong date, and they would look at me, what year do you know when you're born? But I banged it into my head. And I mean, they were generally I found them very friendly places. I mean, my dad had a view that the lowest form of life is the man that ties his shoelace on the doorstep of a pub to avoid buying his round, right? And he says, if you're my son, you buy a round. If people offer you a drink, you offer a drink back. Don't be
Hmm.
a mooch. And that was a lesson that sort of came to me. So some years later, a very good friend of mine from university invited me down to his home in London to stay for a weekend. And his dad was a very famous musician. He was a cellist who had played with the Beatles and with various classical orchestras. Very, very friendly guy. Anyway, he wanted to take Alex and me down to the pub and have a chat. So we went down there and he bought a round of drinks and I insisted on buying a round of drinks. And he kind of looked at me and said, no, you don't need to. I said, no, it's my round. I buy a round. And Alex said to me, I was the only one of his friends ever who sort of told this rich man who drove a Rolls Royce everywhere that I wanted to buy him a drink. He just assumed that everyone would wish off him.
Right.
Anyway, took me very much under his wing and he became a mentor. He was a very good friend to me for many years. And I mean, he was way older than me. He was in his 60s at that point, but had a very ebullient view on life. And so it was a wonderful sort of connection to make.
So, John, you're spending all these times in the pubs, and what is it that you do at these pubs, and how do you spend the time there? It's got to be more than just drinking and watching the cars go by, right?
Conversation. It's all about conversation. It's about connecting with people. The pubs were good really for two things. One is the seeing the friends you want to see and having a decent conversation with them. But also it's the peripheral friends. It's the ones that you haven't seen for a while, aren't that close to, but you say, I haven't seen you for a few hours. How are you doing? How's your girlfriend? Oh, new girlfriend. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean that
Right.
question. Or equally, the other thing that people would do is, you have a football game on a Saturday and we're one man down. Let's go down to the pub and see who we can dragoon. Johnny, are you free tomorrow morning?
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And is this also a place where you would have deeper conversations beyond, sports and social catching up, but political conversations and things like that?
Yes, very much politics. Lots of political conversations. I mean, I was very engaged in the Labour Party when I was a teenager, and the meetings were a little boring. But I love going to the pubs afterwards because you have conversations. And pubs were always very intergenerational. It was always a mingling of different kinds of people and classes and whatever. And I used to like sitting with the old men because they used to squabble about the issues that had really affected their generation. Like for them, it was the Spanish Civil War. This was
Right. Right.
I mean, I was in my teens in the 70s. These were guys who were born about 1910. And for them, the defining issue was, did they go to fight in Spain or did they not? And the majority would say, we shouldn't go to Spain. It was with the communists. It was illegal. Save the energy for World War II, this kind of stuff. But the ones that had gone always looked and said, yeah, but we went.
Uh-huh.
And I didn't realize the impact it had on me until years later. I was telling this story to my nephew that sometimes in life, you just got to show up. That's all.
And the way you're describing it to me, growing up, I didn't go to a school that was particularly diverse, but I wanted to get my hair cut. And so I had to go into the black community to go to the barber
Mm.
shop. And there was always a line, and you'd sit for like 3 hours to get your hair cut. And it was like listening to not just the old folks, but it was very intergenerational. Everybody needs their haircut.
Mhm.
And you would just sit
Yeah.
and just absorb, in my case, absorb the culture and understand what
Yeah.
issues were important or should have been important to me and how people were thinking about them. It becomes like, yes, I'm there for a haircut, or yes, you were there for a pint, but there's just more to it culturally that
Yes.
enriches the experience. It sounds very similar to me to the black communities, barbershops, or hair salons.
Exactly. And the conversation could bounce all over the place. It could be
Right,
football, it could be
right,
the weather, it could be politics, it could actually be someone's in distress.
right.
I mean, yeah, I mean, the conversation could go all over. That was part of the joy of it.
Every time I went, I had no idea what was going to come up. Don't let it be playoff season for sports or political season, and the conversations would just be, and super passionate about everything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
John, when you go back today, is there a pub in particular that is special to you that you go back and visit, or do you still take part in what I'll call pub culture? And is that still a thing for the next generation?
I still take part in it, yes. And there are favorite pubs I like to visit again. It's definitely a changing institution. So, for example, where I'm living now in London, there's a pub around the corner I like, and I'll go there this evening. I'm meeting a friend down there this evening. The pubs have become much more like restaurants. People, they serve food and they become much more at market. When I go back to where I went to college, there's a couple of pubs there which I'd love to visit. And certainly when I was going with the ones I mentioned when I was going to school, if I go back there, I always pop in for a quick one. The big difference, though, I think, is that the texting has killed pubs or is killing pubs, right? Because it used to be that to find you, I'd bang on your door. Your mum would say, he's not here right now. And then I'd go to the pub. And then I'd run in, maybe not run into you, but they'd say, oh, Keith was here a while ago. And it was a way that you defaulted to. And even if you didn't know who was going to be there, you might just wander in and see who's around. Whereas now I text you. The pubs have become destinations rather than a sort of place where you just pop in to see who might be there.
But it sounds like they were more of a social hub. Or
Yeah.
and so even if you weren't going to drink or sit down and spend hours, you would just pop in and be seen and touch base with folks and then keep it moving.
Yeah, classic one. You buy the newspaper, go in there, have half a pint of beer, read the newspaper, ask the barman what's going on, see who's been around, and if no one's around, that's fine. You just go home. But yeah, it was very much a social hub, and it was where you picked up a lot. It's a lot of peripheral vision too, not just seeing your friends, but picking up the gossip, seeing what's going on, understanding what's happening with the football, all that kind of thing.
So, John, when I took my sons to London, we were on our way to South Africa many, many years ago, and they were really geeked to get fish and chips. It's all they kept talking about. And I admit, I don't usually think of British food as one of the great cuisines of the world, but French fries are my French fries are my favorite food, and fish and chips is certainly on my list. Unfortunately, one of them ordered chicken wings at the fish and chips place, which was disappointing given all the hype. But I was curious, is that something that people from England miss when they're away? Like, is that a thing that they don't feel like they can get when they're away from home? And how do you feel about that? Where do you come out on this issue?
Yeah, the fish and chips you get overseas are invariably too crispy and often done a little bit too healthily. I mean, good fish and chips have deep fat fried and are sodden with grease. I mean, for me growing up, it was something my dad would treat us to, and his treat to my mum on a Saturday was say, "Don't cook lunch today, mum." He would say, "I'm going up to town and I'm going to buy us all fish and chips." And so he would disappear up, and he would take me with him. And as a little boy, I used to like going along. It was a bit of an adventure, and he was very much an extrovert. He knew everybody in the town, small town, 20,000 people, and you get these conversations. He would stop and say, "Robbie, is that your boy? Hasn't he grown? Oh my God!" And so I meet all these assorted people who were called aunt, whatever they were, uncle, whatever they were, and we'd finally get to the fish and chip shop, and he would be there talking to his friends, and I would be at sort of this level here looking through, and it was back in the day, when there was no competition with McDonald's, so the service was awful. They would say, "We're frying now." You just had to stand there and wait while
Right.
they're fried.
Right.
And I remember watching this guy with his enormous belly, with his filthy, greasy apron, leaning over the chip pan, making the chips and putting the fish in there, with a cigarette out of his mouth, with the ash falling into the fat.
It's just extra seasoning that you can't get elsewhere.
Exactly. And I have no recollection of it ever making it taste any worse. But that was it was very much a part of the week.
It's funny that you talk about that. When I recorded the introduction and sort of talked about the concept, the example I used of why we're talking about my home being special, and it's not just the things, but it's the memories. It's not the fish and chips, it's the walk with your dad and seeing how liked he was and how connected he was to the community, and sort of, I imagine just having some of similar experiences, like just kind of being in awe, like, wow, I'm like with a celebrity almost. And with my sons, we have our traditions that we do, and I talked about this in the intro, which is we go to certain places to eat when they're home, and it's not necessarily because the food is amazing, but it's just part of the ritual, and the conversations we have on the way to and the way back from those places is what's special, and the food is the reason or the justification for having the conversations in some ways. So, John, every time I go to London, I haven't been many places in England, but every time I go to London, I see these double decker buses, and I always equate them with London. You know, we have the hop on, hop off tourist buses here and in other cities around the world, but in London, they're like the real deal public transit. You mentioned those to me when we spoke as having a special memory for you, potentially even putting your life at risk at different points in your growth as a youth. Can you share a little bit about why the double decker buses are something special for you when you think about home?
Yeah, that's how we got around. Trains were unusual. I mean, you took a train to go to London, but not to get around the town. And I didn't get in a plane till I was 21. And so buses, how you got around, and a lot of them were double deckers. Our buses were run by London Transport, and they had red buses in the city, but out to our countryside area, they had green buses. That's how I got to school and all the rest of it. This was the old buses that had a platform at the back that was open. You could hop on, hop off. They're now illegal because people fell off them and sued. But the beauty of it is kids, we would lean out them. We would hang on the side of the bus as the bus was going up a hill. I mean, very dangerous. I mean, it's the kind of stuff which my parents would have been very unhappy had they seen it go on. But I used to love doing it. And especially when the bus would go up a steep hill. I mean, this is the old buses where they didn't have automatic gears. You'd have good old-fashioned gearboxes, and you have the driver cussing and swearing and cranking down the gears to get this large vehicle up a hill. But no, when you're a kid hanging on the side, it was exciting.
I'm going to add a picture on the post on myhomeisspecial.com of one of these buses because you were describing it to me when we were preparing for this. And John, it's like seriously an open platform on the back
Totally.
of a bus. You can like
Yeah.
100% just hang out the back of this thing, which
Yeah.
is no surprise that there were lawsuits and people getting injured doing exactly what you're describing.
Well, remember that format of the back of a bus in England was normal from the 19 teens right the way and through until I'm guessing about 20 years ago. So for about 80 years, that was the standard. And it's only really when the lawyers became much more active did it finally get killed, you know.
And were there other things that you could do on these buses? I mean, I imagine when I was growing up, it was the back of the bus where it's sort of the questionable
Yeah.
behaviors happened because the driver couldn't
Yeah.
see you. But you all had like a whole second floor on these buses.
Upstairs. That's right. Yeah, exactly. And the other thing about upstairs was that was where the buses used to be that you couldn't smoke on the downstairs, but you could smoke on the upstairs. So where the smoking happened and all kinds of naughtiness could happen on the top of the bus.
That's amazing. And was getting around the town on the bus, or even just getting around the town, something that you did a lot of when you were younger?
Yeah, I mean, walk, take a bike, push bike, take the bus. Yeah, I love walking around. Since I was a little tiny kid, I love maps. It's sort of interesting issue in my family, partly because my great granddad was a big traveler, and my grandmother bought me a little tin globe when I was a kid. So I always loved maps. I always wanted to town. So I like to wander, and I could walk around from a pretty early age. And one of my cousins and I used to just disappear for periods at a time, and it would send our parents clean round the bend. They would get worried about where are you, what's going on, and no, we always just re-emerged fine. I mean, looking back, we were quite young, 6, 7, 8 years old. I mean, I can see why now I'm this age. You see why parents freaked, but we were fine. I mean, the funny part about it was that when my cousin's daughter reached 16, I'm having a conversation with him, and he was terrified. He said, "Johnny, you don't understand. I mean, she goes off on her own." I remember saying, "But Colin, we did that when we were younger than 16." But
Exactly. It's funny how being a parent changes your perspective on what's
yeah,
safe and what's not.
yeah, exactly, yeah.
John, I want to start to wrap us up here and thank you for coming on to talk about England. I've been to London several times and I have several friends that are there, but one of the things I want to try and force myself to do is get outside of London this time and see
Yeah.
some other parts of the country. Are there places that you would recommend that I should try and prioritize, or things that I should try and do outside of London as I try and get a bigger perspective on the country?
There's lots of places to visit, which are very easy to get to from London as well. So you can go to Oxford or Cambridge. They're about an hour away on the train. If you want to go to the south coast, Brighton is a great place to visit. That's only an hour away on the train. So those are sort of three good places. If you want to see the countryside, there's some beautiful places just a little bit further out. The Cotswolds or Cornwall or Devon. There's lots. It's not that far to get into the greenery and wandering around. And if you want to see a bit of highland, you can get further up the country. Wales is also worth a visit too. That's only 2 hours away on the train, and that's a beautiful place. Very different culture.
Thanks for sharing that. As I promised to people that I wouldn't make this a tourism and a best of podcast, but London has such an outsized presence when people think about England that I felt like I needed to make sure I asked what else to see so that I could prioritize
Yeah.
it. Thanks for sharing a little bit about your home and giving me a list of things that I should try and experience when I'm there. The pubs for sure, the fish and chips for sure. And, for the first time, I think I'll get outside of the tube and try and hop on a bus and see if I can hang out the side of the bus at some point during the trip.
They won't let you hang out the side of the bus anymore. That's now illegal. They've stopped them doing that. But you can certainly take double-decker buses. The best way to see London is from the top of a double-decker bus.
And maybe while I'm up there, I'll cause some mayhem and debauchery.
They have cameras on buses now, so you may find yourself on YouTube. But yeah.
Well, thanks. On that note, John, I appreciate you, and I look forward to touching base when we get back.
All right. Take care, Keith. All the very best.
Thanks for listening to this episode of My Home is Special. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you get future episodes automatically. Go to myhomeisspecial.com for the occasional email update too. That's where links to photo galleries and a few other surprises will live. Be sure to follow KBev Photo on Instagram for behind-the-scenes footage during our journey, and it'll be in the stories. If you just want the photos, go to kbevphoto.com. There's a lot else on there to explore. For now, this is Keith, aka KBev, signing off. Peace.